Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for the Hatfield Museum and History Society September Community Program. I'm Larry Stevens, President of the Society, and once again, I am presenting this program live from the research room of the Hatfield History Museum. Although the museum opened to the public back in August of 2020, we were unable to hold a grand opening event at that time due to the pandemic. So we are finally celebrating the opening of the museum next weekend, October 8th and 9th, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. both days. If you haven't yet visited the museum, this would be a great opportunity. And if you have already visited us, you will want to come back to see our all-new basement displays and a preview of our planned outdoor history garden. And we will also have some free goodies for you that day as well. So plan to join us next weekend, October 8th or 9th. If you wouldn't mind, let us know you are watching this program by writing a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And feel free to send us comments throughout tonight's program. We love your feedback and interaction. All right, on with tonight's presentation. As you can imagine, it's not always easy to come up with fresh new ideas for these community programs that I think all of you folks might find interesting. The idea for this program was formed a number of years ago when I came across an old book on the history of Montgomery County. And as I read it, I found quite a bit of information that I never knew and found quite interesting. So I thought if I found it interesting, perhaps you might also. So I took all of the most interesting information from the book and compiled it into tonight's program, which I've titled Our Own Little Corner of the World. Many of you have probably heard that expression sometime before, and I got to wondering about the origin of the phrase. Now, I don't know that she actually invented the expression, but in 1960, Anita Bryant, you old-timers will recognize her name, she wrote a song called In My Little Corner of the World. Anyone out there remember that song? Well, I'll sing it at the end of the program. Maybe I won't. Anyway, my exhaustive research on the internet turned up no other earlier references to the phrase, my little corner of the world. So maybe she did invent it. Nevertheless, tonight's program is all about our little corner of the world, Hatfield, Pennsylvania, and a look back, way back, at how she came to be. If you look at a map of the Earth, the continental United States, in all of its greatness, appears to be only a very small part of the planet. And looking at a map of the United States, our own great state of Pennsylvania, or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for you purists out there, seems like but a small part of our nation. In fact, in a list of states listed by size, Pennsylvania is way down the list at number 32 among the 48 continental states. And if we look at a map of Pennsylvania, that little block of land in the southeast corner of the state, just above Philadelphia, is our county, Montgomery County, one of 67 counties in the state, covering an area of 484 square miles. And finally, if we take a look at a map of Montgomery County, there on the northeastern edge of the county is 10.8 square miles of land that many of us call home, Hatfield. All things considered, our own little corner of the world seems rather small and insignificant. Well, it may be small, but it is, to many of us, most certainly not insignificant. But of course, we don't measure the importance of Hatfield by its size. We measure its importance by the years we've lived here, the friends we've met here, and the families we've raised here, and much more. It's hard to believe, but at one time the land now known as Hatfield, in fact all of Montgomery County and Pennsylvania, was once blanketed by an awe-inspiring primeval forest. Trees towered over 100 feet tall, with trunks measuring 10 feet or more in diameter. These large trees were mostly oak, hickory, and chestnut, but of course there were many other kinds as well. Around 1000 AD, some of the tribes of the Lenape Indians left their settlements west of the Mississippi River to explore the lands to the east. As the wandering tribe grew in size, they separated into different clans and spread throughout the land that would become eastern Pennsylvania and up into the land of the future state of New York. These Indians lived very simple lives. The braves trapped, hunted, and fished using tools of stone, bone, and wood. And the women cared for the crops. Unlike our own society, very little property of the Indian tribes was held by individuals. The little fields that they cleared in the wilderness were farmed jointly by members of the tribe, and they regarded all men as brothers, sharing their few possessions freely, even with strangers. There was very little immorality in the conduct of the Lenape Indians, and the average tribal settlement was seldom bothered by quarrels among its members. In short, the Lenape Indian civilization, though extremely simple and underdeveloped, was generally harmonious and kind. The climate of the lands that would become Montgomery County was excellent for the early settlers of the area. The temperature of the area is quite moderate, with average temperatures around 32 degrees in January and about 76 degrees in July. The rain that falls on this area is pretty equally distributed throughout the year, totaling an average of about 40 inches or more a year. Surely, superior soils can be found in other parts of Pennsylvania, like Lancaster County, but Montgomery County can nevertheless also boast of her fertile farms. A good supply of water resources throughout the county was another great advantage to the early settlers. Streams penetrate nearly every part of the county. Most of these streams, like the Wissahickon and the Skippack, flow into the Schuylkill River. Only two creeks, the Pennypack Creek and the Neshaminy Creek, which of course flows through Hatfield, wend their way to the Delaware River. In fact, the waters of Hatfield flow to both the Schuylkill River and the Delaware River, with Coffle Road and Elroy Road being roughly the dividing line. Looking at this map, rain falling on the land above the yellow line flows to the Neshaminy Creek and on to the Delaware River. Below Coffle and Elroy Roads, the waters flow towards Talmenton Township to the Skippack Creek and on to the Schuylkill River. For some reason, I find that fact very interesting, so maybe you do too. Many of the first Europeans to settle on the land of Montgomery County, especially the Quakers and the German people, dealt fairly and kindly with the Native American Indians that they found living on the land. Like the Lenape Indians, they had a strong conviction of human brotherhood. But as more and more adventurers moved into the area, the rules of mutual respect were broken. And by the time William Penn arrived in 1682 to take possession of his province of Pennsylvania, some of the Lenape Indian groups had already begun to move back westward to separate themselves from the invading white man. But even after the main body of their tribe had moved west, some Indians preferred to stay on the lands of the future Montgomery County to dwell with the white families with whom they had established close relationships. They were treated fairly by the Quakers who settled in the area, for they regarded the Indians as the original owners of the land. Unlike the early settlers of New England, who considered the Indians as savage inhabitants to be forced off the land as soon as possible. There, the initial friendship between the Pilgrims and Indians soon faded and turned to bloodshed. The settlement of Montgomery County, however, took place without any bloodshed between the Indians and the white man. According to the History of Hatfield, written by historian David Alabach in 1944, tradition, strongly supported by known facts, holds that the last Indian village in Montgomery County was right here in Hatfield, located on the banks of the Little Neshaminy Creek near the present Hatfield Church of the Brethren. There they held sort of an encampment along the small creek and a burial place on the higher grounds of the area. Gradually, hungry for land of their own, more and more settlers left the growing village of Philadelphia and ventured out into the wilderness of what would become Montgomery County. Since their chief occupation was farming, they would purchase the largest tracts of land that they could afford. The first wave of settlers into present-day Montgomery County during the last years of the 17th century was composed of three main groups of people: the English, Welsh, and German. For the most part, each of these groups settled into separate areas and did not mingle very much with each other. Here in Hatfield, it was the Welsh and German that were prominent among the early settlers. With the arrival of the early settlers, the great forest gradually disappeared. Clearing the wilderness was not an easy job. Trees were cut down to build houses and to create open land for farming. The most important thing to these early settlers was family and home. All work centered around the home. Next to the home in importance was the church. The church of colonial times was the one thing that brought men together to work on a community level. For early settlers of Montgomery County, government was not nearly as important as it is today. Most families were self-sufficient and did not need the helping hand of government. If welfare services became necessary, most help of that nature came from the church. Also, mutual aid, cooperation for the common good, was a more active principle in people's lives than it is today, when almost every social problem gets passed on to the shoulders of the government. The local township governments in those early years merely helped to keep the peace on the rare occasion when that was necessary. It's very difficult to comprehend, I think, how much all of the land of Pennsylvania would be worth. So one would think that William Penn, who was given all of the lands of Pennsylvania by King Charles II to satisfy a debt owed to his father, would have amassed quite a fortune from selling off his Pennsylvania land. This was not the case, however. In fact, the settling of Pennsylvania was a financial disaster, and Penn eventually had to spend a short time in debtor's prison in England. One reason for this was that many who came to Pennsylvania did not bother to take legal possession of the land that they occupied. It is estimated that by the early 1700s, about 100,000 squatters had settled on Pennsylvania land, and as you can imagine, it would have been virtually impossible to quickly evict 100,000 squatters. Practically every Pennsylvania house built in colonial days had at least one, and sometimes as many as a half dozen or more, fireplaces. A home's made fireplace was usually huge, from 7 to 14 feet wide. Not only was the fireplace where the housewife prepared meals for the family, but it was also where the family gathered together in the evening to eat, work, pray, spin their cloth, and plan their future. But what did these early settlers do for fun? Of course, people of those days were not as focused on recreation as we are today. Their lifestyle simply didn't allow much time for sheer amusement. But they certainly had their share of good, clean fun as they turned daily work into festive occasions. Early settlers found most of their recreation in being mutually helpful to each other. Work such as raising a house or barn, rolling logs as land was cleared, husking corn, threshing and harvesting wheat, butchering or boiling apple butter often required the cooperation of a whole neighborhood, and these occasions usually meant lots of fellowship and refreshments. Now, at this time, a neighborhood wasn't what it is today. A great majority of early settlers preferred having many acres of land around their home, for land was their measure of security. So a country neighborhood could extend over a number of square miles, with a church, or perhaps several churches, as the focus point. Of course, in addition to the many occasions for cooperative work, the early settlers also celebrated the great religious holidays. Special events in the life of the family were also celebrated to some extent. Oddly, however, marriage was rarely the occasion for social festivities, while funerals were much more social events. Funeral feasts were common in most communities, especially the Pennsylvania Germans, when the most important food item was a plentiful supply of pies, particularly raisin pie, which was known far and wide as funeral pie. Most of the colonial farmer's life centered around food production. Cooking and baking were done in the large open fireplaces that I mentioned earlier. And there were no matches for these early settlers. They wouldn't be invented until 1827. And so it was very important that the fire in the fireplace was always kept burning. To restart a fire with flint and steel was sometimes a very difficult task. Teams of chimney sweeps, one man with several small boys who could crawl up the chimney, were regularly hired to clean the soot from the chimney. Every effort was made to keep the all-important fireplace and the hearth with its many gleaming utensils in prime working order. Candles, of course, were the chief means of lighting the home at night during this time, and water was supplied to the household from a hand-dug well, or if you were fortunate, a nearby spring. Slavery was never popular here in Montgomery County. In the first place, most farms were comparatively small and could be effectively worked by the family and perhaps one or two hired workers. And secondly, many of the people who settled Montgomery County were opposed to slavery on religious grounds. In 1742, Hatfield was incorporated as a township in Philadelphia County. Now, this is an actual road map of Hatfield Township that Rand McNally published in 1742. As you can see, the only two established roads in the township at that time were the King's Highway, which would eventually be called the Bethlehem Pike, and the Cowpath Road. The King's Highway was opened in 1714 and the Cowpath Road in 1740. The land of Hatfield Township was one of the last to be settled in the area because the soil, with its high clay content, was just not as favorable for farming. For settlers of Hatfield, it required much work over many years to improve the quality of the soil. It is uncertain how the name of the new township was selected. One tradition holds that it was named to honor an early settler of the area, a Mr. John Hatfield, while another states that Hatfield was named after a village in Hertfordshire, England. But since there is no solid proof either way, you're welcome to believe whichever you prefer. Early settlers in Montgomery County at first practiced subsistence farming. That is, most of the food produced on the farm was consumed by the farmer and his family. But to really prosper, farmers would expand their fields so that they would have surplus crops to sell at market. For early farmers, with an easy access to the Schuylkill River, transporting their goods to the city markets by boat was quite convenient. But settlers in the interior of the county much preferred to travel over land, so roads became economic lifelines for them. Fortunately for them, William Penn was a visionary, and he made full provisions for the development of roads and highways from the very beginning. He also designated that the great roads, those connecting important towns, should be 40 feet wide. Of course, back then, a road 40 feet wide probably seemed absurd, when only an occasional horse-drawn wagon would be using it. And to maintain a road 40 feet wide would have taxed the resources of the settlers too much. So usually only about 15 feet was kept in good repair. And by good repair, I don't mean a smooth road. Back then, good repair meant that the road was cleared of logs, fallen trees, and other obstructions. The roadbed was almost always extremely rough and rutted. And since only a fraction of the 40-foot road width was maintained, property owners on each side gradually absorbed the remainder of the road into their farms. Two more of these great roads were opened through Hatfield Township shortly before the Revolution. The Allentown Road, which cuts through a small corner of the township, was established around 1750. And the 40-foot road, named of course for the street width standard of that time, was opened in 1760. By the end of the colonial period, that is, by around 1776 or so, a network of early roads penetrated to almost all main sections of the county. Most of these were simple cartways used for transporting farm produce. At this time, most travelers still rode on horseback because the roads just weren't good enough for carriage travel. And besides, very few colonists could afford the luxury of a coach. Only one stagecoach line, the mass transit of that time, operated during colonial times in what would become Montgomery County. It was established in 1763 and ran from Philadelphia to Bethlehem on what became known as the Bethlehem Pike. Hotels, taverns, and soon villages were established along the route to serve its travelers. The stage line stopped in Hatfield Township, where Bethlehem Pike meets the County Line Road. This stop was known as Housekeepers, and soon a village was established here. Only a small part of this village was actually in Hatfield, though. The rest was located in Hilltown and New Britain townships. Around 1800, the village became known as Middletown, since it was at the approximate halfway point on the stage route between Philadelphia and Bethlehem. This was an important station on the stage line since it was where a change of horses was made and passengers were given the opportunity to dine. Around 1810, a village hat maker chose the name Lexington from the Revolutionary War battle to use as his trademark. He also gave that name to the village. So when the post office was established there in 1827, it also took the name Lexington. It was soon discovered, however, that there was another Lexington in Erie County, so the word line was added to show that the village straddled the line between Bucks and Montgomery County. After the colonies declared their independence, more stagecoach lines were soon established, connecting Philadelphia to areas like Lancaster and Reading. Also around the close of the Revolutionary War, the Indians of Hatfield Township, the last remaining Indians in the area, abandoned their encampment along the Little Neshaminy Creek. Before abandoning the hunting grounds of their fathers and starting on their journey west, they held nightly dances and solemn ceremonies for more than a week, lighting huge council fires that could be seen for miles. The early Hatfield settlers, naturally, were very much alarmed by this activity, as they weren't really sure what these ceremonies meant, and the Indians would not tell them. Could it be that they had become angry and were preparing for an attack? But one morning, the settlers found the Indian camp deserted and in ashes. The Indians had disappeared during the night and burned everything that they could not carry with them. It is believed that they journeyed west to the Wabash River County in Indiana, where a number of their people had settled some years earlier. As peace settled over the land after the Revolution, a movement began for creating a new county from the western rural part of Philadelphia County. Most farmers in the area felt that their taxes were unduly high because of the expenses that the city dwellers were responsible for. And if you had any official business to attend to, you had to travel all the way to the county seat in Philadelphia. In 1782, a petition was presented to the Pennsylvania General Assembly to create a new county with the new county seat in Pottstown. This, of course, was not approved. Then, in 1784, a petition was presented to the Assembly to create a new county with the county seat being in Norton Township. Opposition to this plan came from residents of Germantown and Chestnut Hill, who strenuously objected to a county seat in any location where a village did not exist. You see, at that time, Norristown did not even exist as a village, and there wasn't even a tavern in the proposed new county seat. Nonetheless, on September 10th, 1784, Montgomery County became Pennsylvania's 15th county, with the county seat in the wilderness of Norton Township. Why the name Montgomery was chosen for the new county has never been clearly defined. And like the naming of Hatfield, there are two theories. One is that there were two influential members of the state assembly at that time by the name of Montgomery, and it is thought that the new county received their name to assure their support for the new county. Another suggestion is that the county was named after one of the oldest townships in the new county, Montgomery Township, which was organized in 1717. The center of activity for the new county took place in a tavern in what is now Jeffersonville, until 1791, when the first county courthouse was built in what would become Norristown. Soon, of course, houses sprung up all around the new courthouse, and the village of Norristown was born. As they say, time is money, and they knew that also back in the early years of Hatfield. So beginning in 1828, railroad lines started to be built to connect large population centers with each other for a quick, economical movement of people, produce, and products. And throughout the county, wherever a station was placed on these rail lines, villages began to grow. Many of these villages would eventually grow to become boroughs. In the early 1850s, the North Penn Railroad began construction of a railroad line to run from Philadelphia to New York through the rapidly growing Lehigh Valley. Engineering and financial difficulties made progress slow, however, and by 1855, trains ran only as far as Gwynedd Station. The railroad was never built to New York, but on July 7, 1857, the line was finally completed from Philadelphia to Bethlehem through the open farmland of Hatfield Township. The next day, the first passenger car traveled over these new rails, stopping at the Hatfield station, located on the Cowpath Road, across from what is now the main hotel. This set the wheels in motion that would eventually result in the creation of the borough of Hatfield. Of course, people began to build and settle in the area of the Hatfield train station, drawn by its convenience to public transportation. The village that developed in this area was known as Lower Hatfield and also South Hatfield. Then, on April 1st, 1873, a land speculator by the name of Joseph Proctor purchased 9 acres of land located on both sides of the railroad tracks that ran from what is now East Lincoln Avenue to Union Street. In February 1874, in a shrewd business deal, Proctor sold 2.5 acres of this land to the North Pennsylvania Railroad Company for $1, on the condition that the Hatfield Railroad Station would be moved from its location at the Cowpath Road crossing to the new railroad property. Proctor knew that the relocated station would dramatically increase the value of his remaining 6.5 acres. Notice that there is virtually no development at all on Proctor's land in this 1871 map. The railroad moved the station, and Proctor subdivided his land, having little trouble selling the lots that were now so convenient to the train station, as you can see on this 1877 map. The village that developed around the relocated station was known as Upper Hatfield, and also just Hatfield and Hatfield Station. The Upper and Lower Hatfields together were known as Hatfield Village. By the 1890s, the bicycle was becoming a more common mode of transportation, and some folks got very creative on how to use them. An 1895 Hatfield Invincible newspaper article described how one young man who lived outside of town came into town one evening with his carriage hitched to his bicycle. Even pulling the carriage, he reportedly was traveling at a pretty good rate of speed. In Edward Matthews' historical account of Hatfield Township, written in 1896, he wrote of Hatfield Village, "Here along the Cowpath and other highways, and about the chief railroad station, has grown up extensive interests, and a population rising above 300, with about 75 dwellings. It is only a question of time when the place will have grown to borough proportions. As Matthews had predicted, 1 year later, on November 8, 1897, the editor and publisher of the Hatfield Invincible newspaper stated, "It has been suggested that we call attention to the citizens to the fact that it would be more pleasing if the town had more street lights. Now we think it would be more to the benefit of the town if the citizens would get together and have the towns incorporated into a borough." In early 1898, the more progressive thinking citizens of the village called a town meeting at Chester Knight's Hotel at what is now Broad Street and East Lincoln Avenue to see if there was enough support to move forward with the idea of forming a borough. Although a petition was prepared and signed by many of the residents of South Hatfield stating that they were very much opposed to taking their part of the village into borough government, the citizens in favor of a borough were undeterred and hired an attorney to start the procedure of incorporation. The June 30, 1898 edition of the Hatfield Invincible ran a story stating that on Monday, June 27th, Judge Aaron Swartz affixed his signature to a decree incorporating the towns of Hatfield and South Hatfield into a borough under the name of the Borough of Hatfield. And so the Borough of Hatfield was born. It wasn't long after that a trolley line was established from Philadelphia to Allentown, again passing through Hatfield Township and Hatfield Borough, roughly following the path of the railroad. In addition to the railroad line, the trolley now added another opportunity for rapid, economical travel, making Hatfield and other communities along the routes very attractive for families who wanted to get out of the big cities. And of course, as we entered a new century, everyone was thinking about the new horseless carriages, the automobile. With its rapidly growing popularity and the quickly expanding and improving road system, a whole new age of freedom of travel opened up, making quick and easy access to even remote areas possible. As industry and commerce grew in suburban Philadelphia, so of course did the population. And bit by bit, the land that was once a great forest inhabited by Indians, the land that early settlers worked so hard to clear so that they could grow crops to feed their families, the land that generations of farming families toiled in to make livelihoods for themselves, this land was gradually lost to suburban sprawl. Sure, there are those of us who have lived in Hatfield for some time certainly sometimes miss the days when farm tractors traveling slowly on the roads of Hatfield were commonplace, when it was not unusual to hear the sound of cows, roosters, and other farm animals travel through the quiet Hatfield air. But most of us, I think, would agree that life is still pretty good here in Hatfield, our own little corner of the world. And that's it for tonight's program. Let me get my mouse. All right, there we go. I'm back. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program and found it interesting as I did. And we're hoping that we'll be able to be back together in person for our November community program. We'll see what happens. But until then, I hope you can plan to stop by for our grand opening celebration, October 8th or 9th, and come out and visit the new Hatfield History Museum. All right, thanks again for joining us. and have a good night.